Mongol invasion has remained in the centuries as an example of monstrous devastation, brutality, and beyond all limits of terrible warfare, while in fact it was obviously not such. However, Gumilev had already written a whole book, The Black Legend, but this is a collection of articles. But he really was a man who treated the Mongols with undisguised sympathy, and occupied enough for the outside position. I have a slightly different approach. I urge you, if you want to read this book, of course. It is useful. There are many facts here. But I urge you to think differently. Let's think about it. Let's think about it together. Let's reflect and analyze, because events of such colossal proportions as the Mongol invasion could not but leave a deep mark in the history of different peoples. The trail is the same among peoples who did not even know much about it. It is obvious that there were deep reasons for this, which must be revealed and shown. And so we talked about the fact that the starting point of the Black Legend was Genghis Khan himself, who deliberately pursued a policy of terror in order to intimidate the enemy, in order to paralyze Israel to fight. And he himself supported the spread of this Black Legend because panic, the army flying ahead of him, opened the gates of impregnable fortresses and Tory lane to the Mongols in the best way. The flesh to the last sea is an absolutely indisputable thing. But this is not enough, because lies have short legs. If it were only Mongol propaganda, if in fact their atrocities were not superior to the atrocities of ordinary conquerors, which were then very numerous in the 13th century around the world, to the world, from the Atlantic to the Pacific Ocean, well, after a while people would realize that this was just propaganda, and there would still be weighted averages in history towards them. Well, the communists have been rubbing their propaganda on us for 70 years about what they are doing. Well, after 70, no one believed in what was being broadcast on TV screens and combined with newspaper pages. So puddles of short legs. If it were just propaganda, of course, this would not have happened. But you and I see that the echoes of the idea of the enormity of the Mongol invasion are extremely widely artificial, and we were taught at school, and we all know this. And we know that. But as Nikolai Gavrilovich Chernyshevsky said, they passed like a storm, destroyed everything, burned the floors, all plundered. And only now the Mongols, or the Tatars, swept over Russia like clouds of locusts. Like a hurricane surrounding everything that came in his way, they ravaged cities, burned villages, plundered each other. After all these horrors, they disappeared across the Caspian Sea, from time to time sending their ferocious hordes from there to remind the conquered peoples of their rule. This is the 19th century Herzen. This was all taken from the 13th century. The Measles of God. The Armenian monk Vardan wrote on 6. In these unknown hordes of unknown language speaking people called the Korna and the Tatars, who marched out of the country like clouds of locusts and devastated towns and villages and brought Christian peoples to disaster. This is the Armenian historian Matthew Paris, who did not see the Mongols at all but lived far, far away, and in Europe, far away in Paris. The number, respectively, his name was Matthew of Paris. He responded to them like locusts. We recall Herzen. They spread, that is, the Mongols spread across the face of the earth. They brought terrible devastation to the eastern parts, ravaging them with fire and sword. Passing through the land of the Saracens, they razed cities to the ground, cut down forests, did not disgorge fortresses, pulled out vineyards, devastated gardens, killed. This is a very typical assessment of townspeople and peasants, which cannot be explained solely by propaganda and the deliberate spread of this Black Legend. It is not only that when such smoke is seen all over the continent, it is quite obvious that there are real problems behind it somewhere. And therefore let us see what were the reasons for this attitude towards the Mongols. There were fewer of these reasons than objective ones. To the first, the reason is that the Mongol way of warfare for all Western countries turned out to be completely unexpected and terrible. In the West, war in the 13th century was a chivalrous affair. But here is a noble war. Killed. This is a very typical assessment of townspeople and peasants, which cannot be explained solely by propaganda and the deliberate spread of this black legend. It is not only that when such smoke is seen all over the continent, it is quite obvious that there are real problems behind it somewhere. And therefore let us see what were the reasons for this attitude towards the Mongols. There were fewer of these reasons than objective ones. To the first, the reason is that the Mongol way of warfare for all Western countries turned out to be completely unexpected and terrible. In the West, war in the 13th century was a chivalrous affair. But here is a noble war. Russian princes fought with the Pelovsian economies, so they went to war, then reconciled, later intermarried, made a feast, and then together we went somewhere to fight. It was here's a war, the few knights who went in the distant hiking the common people, but it the mob, which only serves her. But you can loot, but in principle, it is necessary scot why him. Too much robbery, therefore. It is necessary to cut the attitude of the common people in Russia and in the Pelovsian steppe. Here you Krimchaks and Western Europe and the Muslim East about the same this paradise. And this valuable asset, it is sometimes useful to ruin that, to undermine the power of the enemy, but to capture the best and uses their favor. That there's somewhere at the bottom, but we up here. Fun war. Osama Red Moon, Chris famous Muslim enemy, the Crusaders, who wrote about these reed fights. They are available. There it described King's War in the Middle East, with the deepest respect for the enemy and Christian knights, similarly respected Muslims, and with contempt for all that this who's down there crawling, all this the herd still all human. The peasantry some love to see me, the people suffering, not starving, naked to warm them. Bertrand de Born. And then is the same of the medieval French, the poet well. The same could be said of any Russian prince of the Pelovsian the Muslim world. So the war was here, this is their master's business. Mobile, so low was the roll that they even attracted only as subservient the infantry was on. It was taken from a well because someone had to prepare food for the Lord, and for the Lord to care for the horses, to brush their tents, to put it in the end. I don't know what way under the pants when they were eager. Therefore, as a rule, even in a fight you'll not use, only allowed here in the camp, in the defense of the camps, in the assault cities, but there's really not Barsky the case to go somewhere on the wall, where all pour the oil is boiling. Let these years and we're going, then the gate will open. We're breaking all, chop down. The losses were quite low at war, and large, did not concern the common people. And here came the Mongols, which is a completely different attitude to war. The war was a matter very seriously happy tribal attitude to the war as vendetta, because we all live in the world, that it is dangerous to fight. Scale it, kill my family, to me it will be very better. will avenge this, and as revenge if I murdered someone. So there will be me revenge. So the war could end only when the enemy were completely destroyed, and no one to retaliate. Will Genghis Khan, when he saw how Gul led in fighting in the Battle of Andi, and he brought the captured son, this 7-year Gul lady Muslim boy, who looked askance him a brave sight, he ordered his to kill, because these brave grandchildren Muslims will kill my grandchildren. Will not to avenge his slaughtered the Mongols, destroyed the tip of the root, because they knew that war is extremely serious, and it was a total war where a mass murder was natural tie and they affect, because the enemy, it's all his people, because it is necessary at the root line, bend in the knee, grab his property well, as their Genghis Khan said, the wombs of the women, to turn into a rug for men. So on a completely different attitude to the war. East Asian, brutally total relationship to Anna. Of course, it was a culture shock when faced the Western world, Muslim, Christian, this East Asian attitudes to the war. How terrible bloody work of the people, because against the night of the units beware the Kipchak Russia, the Muslim East or West night standing national army, that is in fact a general military service. And of course, it was a completely different war. And the shock was very scary because that is not accustomed to people in the West. 2. Here's what they cut, then you captured, you have full ransom to let go. And there's nothing like captured prisoners and representatives, the ruling classes. The Mongols just to kill the humans. They were afraid of punishment from heaven, therefore. Because of the Polovtsynkins, knew just kill them, and Kotyan fought until his last. The Mongols, he first fled Russia, then in Hungary, Baya in Bulgaria, convinced will fight to the last. That for him, there is no life simultaneously. Konbatchu of Sabyatai Bogota, it will kill if the Mongols win, and everybody knew their people. And they fought to the end, the common people who, yes, there are days we Mongols differently about the same holes. He's not sorry, please, here gathered residents created drove to the assault of Vladimir. Let caught Russian boom water in old men and women and other means not sty. Combatants, when arrows over wheel climb the walls, take this Vladimir, it was unusual, it was scary. And shock is what impressed, but not for the first time in history really case. The Mongols were at war about as well as the Romans in ancient times. The author of Romans in the time was struck by the Greeks, the Hellenistic world. That's brutal total war against it, where the Greeks fought, as Alexander the Great taught. The Romans came here and the Greeks there with long spears, unsubscribed from each other in battle. They had weak cavalry. The Romans came with a weak sound. And these are the impressions of these Greeks from Macedonia over the first battle, with a temporary one. When they saw these severed hands and open bellies with short Roman swords, their shock was cultural. They were not used to fighting like this when they began to surrender, and raised copies of the Mongolian Serisophors, a sign that we were ending the resistance of Rome. They were simply cut out, and what they were doing then was conquered by the Roman commander. And he sold the entire population of European countries. Just the entire population of the country Carthage was taken, then 700,000 inhabitants lived. There was the richest Hellenistic metropolis of antiquity, 50,000 survivors of the massacre that lasted during the assault. There were 7 days of street fighting before the extermination. The legionnaires were knee-deep in blood, so Carthage, 50,000 of them were sold into slavery. The city was leveled and salt was sprinkled so that nothing would grow on this place. But then they built a new year there with the same name, but in fact such a toko. They also took Corinth, destroyed everything, and destroyed the city. Apple Talon on Greek culture, the Romans, or an all-out war. The Greeks were the war in limited at this time when the Greeks began to defeat. The Greeks were in shock, they were a cultural shock, horror, panic, yes. But then you tell me immediately what to listen to, and to the Romans as Vongola. No one is Ren is not noble civilized state. It carried the light Hellenistic Greco-Roman culture, conquered all sorts of Gauls, the Germans and other Thracian docks, and here some Mongols is completely different. And what's more, it is not also about the cultural shock was about the same. But the impression in history was left completely broken. Surely there must be a reason, but what reason? But just think what the Roman conquest differs from Mongolian. And the fact that Rome is, in addition to the legions, it was the state. And the vim characteristic, than he entered, than he left, trace your in history legions. No, the Romans left their mark in home history, main contribution to the world. The civilization, that ancient Rome is Roman law ex Mango, but the Mongols did no write anything. Which culture they army time series let them have their own culture was such a secondary, but it is still bought high enough. So they quickly, as from bags to say in Greek, the culture of the Greek gods, and under flag of Greco-Roman civilization is all spread around, then known worldwide as the Mongols, where they spread, and that they could spread, that they could give the conquered peoples. Could Rome to bring civilization, the aqueducts of the bath, the way the laws of the state brought Genghis Khan. He could bring the Chinese, the Persians, Russian, Europeans, that the Mongols could hold. They were nomads, their writing was not when Genghis Khan started to create their own state, he million to create, it was neither a state, this was the army in the war. and the army on the war could only bring blood, the devastation of the fires and suffering. And that's about it, brought if confirmation of my words, in effect the conquest, if after academician Barthold, still in his 20s, proved this conclusion, he nor deny, despite the fact that generation of historians try to pretend that it does not exist, to shut up, somehow dismiss, but he also wrote about the fact that is proven, and despite manufactured by the Mongols, emptying the first time in the existence of the Mongol Empire was a time of economic and cultural heyday for all areas which could too use the effects of widely developed under the Mongols trade and closer than ever before, and after the cultural communication between West and East Asia is Bartlett in 1920, that is, when the Mongols united all this, there would be a flourishing, and we would see later that yes, it would be the most interesting thing in Russia, then in Russia, under the Mongol era. The population would grow by 100% in a very short historical period of time. And yet, despite this word about the death of the Russian, the lands of Metropolitan Hilarion of the 13th century are ruined in the head. But he just dry out of thin air. It really meant that they felt that way, and it was according to whom the monstrous decline in population during the Mongol conquest was monstrous, simply unheard of, having no analogues in history either before or after the gods in northern China in the Jin Empire. Before the beginning of the Mongol conquest, 40 million people lived, according to Vorobyov, who wrote a book about the Jin Empire. 48 million people are like 40 or 48, and when the Mongols conquer northern China and conduct a census there in terms of taxation, it will turn out that there will be 4,800,000 people left in northern China. 480 have decreased by 10 times during the years of the Mongol conquest. In general, the war will continue indefinitely in China. However, when the Mongols conquer China, if China is divided into northern and southern China by the beginning of the 13th century, it will be 140. Millions of people can be more when the Kublai era ends by the end of the 13th century in 1300. The population is estimated, according to the data of the tax censuses, that Angola conducted 68 million people than it is after Miller has been there for some time. They will breed again even despite this, but they will decrease more significantly by more than half. In fact, much larger numbers are doomed. Do you understand the scale of the human demographic catastrophe in China? Iran. 9 million people lived in Iran at the beginning of the Mongol invasion. By the end of this invasion, according to the data of the Mongolian military and tax censuses, 1.5 million people remained. The population decreased by almost 9 times. Licked it off with my tongue in Georgia, which by and large was not particularly subjected to such monstrous devastation, because the war did not last so long on the territory of Georgia, but even there, out of 2.5 million people in Georgia proper, 2.5 million will remain, and if you ask us for information, there will be no military operations in Russia for a long time. Nevertheless, however, we see the same picture everywhere. It is not reduced by a percentage many times, but by up to 10 times. This is a very large reduction in seats. You will say, well, here you have proof of the Mongol atrocities. It was all killed by Angola. No, this is not quite true, or rather, not at all. We saw that the atrocities the Mongols did not occur normally at that time. But when we talk about the fact that the population of some cities was subjected to wholesale extermination or defeat, why then find out that these cities after a while you stood up, again exposing thousands of militia? It is unclear where you went. But nevertheless, we will assume that this was the case. But when the Crusaders took Jerusalem, they also killed up to 70,000 Muslims there who fled to the protection of the impregnable Jerusalem walls. The practice of medieval warriors was common at that time. But here We are talking about reducing the population of entire countries by 7 million. This is certainly not a direct murder and war. It's the consequence of the invasion of savage, illiterate nomads, who are by and large accustomed to a fairly primitive lifestyle, into a rather complex economic system that had developed by the 13th century, because in China, Iran, and Europe, as Pushkin said, the Mongols, having conquered Russia, did not give her algebra or Aristotle. Indeed, they could not give them to her, but they could bring death to them. Well, imagine that today some Bantu or Ethiopians would conquer Russia. Not only that they were strangers, but they were also wild. They would simply destroy this whole system on which 150 million people live in. Because without centralized water supply and the supply of products to complexly organized cities, everything will also fall apart. Instant colossal sacrifices will simply happen because this economic system will collapse. That's exactly the same thing happened during the Mongol invasion. The civilized society of the East. The Chinese suffered mainly from the consequences of the collapse of the Yellow River state. These very dams broke and just washed away a few millions of people went north of the Dunatyres into the Yellow Sea, and then when the dam breaks, it took and flowed south of the Tyres there. Just like that. And the whole peninsula was washed away practically. The fact is that it will bring a lot of wade owls, and this suspension is deposited. The river is constantly changing its direction, and the Chinese, and to pacify the dam, was built now, for example, and Jorge flows above the level of the surrounding plains of 9 to 12 meters, 20. And mystery at the same, and then it was so accordingly. What it means broken dams, and how not to break if none of them is watching if the war is. If the Mongols destroy all that, they nomads do not care about the Chinese hunger. Naturally arose from hunger which hit China in there. 2 million died right there in the Middle Asia from the consequences of the destruction of dams. And supplied water to organic disease killed far more people than actually. From the fighting the destruction of the dam in the Middle Asia, also not agriculture, that means no expressed hunger if hunger, and people just die very quickly. Using spoon the hunger when 7 million from us died in the 20th year just for one season too. There was nothing. The same thing happened in Iran, and the same was in the Caucasus. And here are the consequences: invasion, wild nomads, in hard enough difficult to organize the economy. They were much harder than it yourself invasion. And here, we have this here, the catastrophic decline in the numbers population. Naturally, this could not to be perceived as something terrible and monstrous. We are again returning to the same example with the Bantu, who suddenly won in Russia. It would be the same thing, is absolutely terrible, monster terrible. Despite the fact that they themselves, Bantu, may be nothing bad except how to win plunder. They capture their power to establish, not would have in mind, and then we even some mirror. Have you taken an organizational orderly terrible, monster terrible? Despite the fact that they themselves, Bantu, may be nothing bad except how to win plunder. They capture their power to establish, not would have in mind, and then we even some mirror. Have you taken an organizational order to resume some kind of trade here? Everything will be resumed, but at a level, at a lower here. In 10 times fell and then began to grow slowly, and already from this level of the fall here is the flourishing about which the academician said Bertolli, which is really on fixed springs. United the Mongol Empire to the flowering of this, but what the heyday after all will collapse first. And of course, such destruction of the economy of the world system to ensure the lives of millions. She was seen as a horror and a scary and absolutely apocalyptic event. And of course, once the Mongols were the reason this event, then they earned relationships matching was moved, so a black legend about the Mongols, yes. It has under, in addition to being conscious, the policy of terror which Tench himself spent, but it was a wartime actions intimidation apart from the fact that he himself strongly contributed to the spread of these panic rumors. And news from was such propaganda, Mongolian horror panic, and all the terrible rumors. but it was also the third and most important component of why there's a black legend rooted centuries caused by the plague economic disaster, accompanied by the extinction of death, huge quantity in China in general, tens of millions of people in the Middle East of millions of people, and this horror he stayed in the history and he saved is associated with here is black Mongolian legend, and accordingly let the roots still all that we have in our minds, so the Mongols and have remained so. But historians should not to understand people who are trying to get in the history of where we got the gift of God, and where egg patties and where flies were real quoted, and where the consequences of their, which they are stupid themselves, or not to think I could not especially this attention paid, because they both live in their yurts and lived for them it was still there, and with these today there is anyone out there from the hunger dying they have some sheep grazing. Okay, so not all black legend. The Mongols, contrary to what he wrote by himself, still has a very objective grounds, but modern man versed in the history of need to understand this legend later. They were a little bit other reasons here to distinguish between conscious action, the Mongol Khan's generals, from those the consequences of those actions led. That is all for today.